What is up, guys? It's your boy Steadychaos coming to you with a quick little comparison video. So in my most recent video that I posted regarding The Last of Us Part 2 and my picture settings, there's a little bit of back and forth with some of the people in the comment section of that video saying that dynamic tone mapping is better, or HDR looks better with it off, with dynamic tone mapping off, or they say that HGiG is the best way to go for the most realistic looking high dynamic range in your video games. So there's some back and forth, and honestly I find that opinions vary greatly. They really are all over the place. And like I say with all of my videos as it pertains to picture settings, this is your TV, you paid for it. There really is no right or wrong setting. Whatever looks best to you is what you really should use, despite what anybody says. But with all that out of the way, I just wanted to look at HGiG compared to dynamic tone mapping on and off. And I'm not gonna really try to tell you one is better than the other. I prefer dynamic tone mapping on because I feel like it provides the best visual image. It sort of increases global illumination of the screen, meaning the entire picture gets brighter. There is the risk of some slight clipping in the brightest areas when using dynamic tone mapping, at least in my experience there is, but I don't believe that any risk of clipping is so bad that you should turn dynamic tone mapping off or resort to using HGiG. Now, HGiG is a relatively new high dynamic range setting specifically for video games. It has been created by a consortium of companies looking to get the most pleasing and accurate image for high dynamic range. And the problem with it is because it's so new, there aren't many games that have been specifically developed. Really, there aren't any games that have been specifically developed with HGiG in mind, with the exception of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. That said, that doesn't mean that using HGiG won't make a difference on your screen, even if you're using it with a game that has not been developed with HGiG in mind. So to illustrate that, I'm going to switch through the picture settings here. Now you see I've stopped The Last of Us Part 2 on a particularly bright area here. We're inside of a building and we're looking out into a bright sun-soaked sky. So it's a little bit overcast, but it's outside of here, it's very bright. So here we have dynamic tone mapping off. This probably is, like I said, the most accurate setting as it follows the EOTF curve most closely with a gentle roll-off near peak brightness for the television, which would prevent clipping. Now HGiG, what it's doing is it's using the console, the PlayStation 4, to do the tone mapping or to map the metadata instead of the TV. So let's turn that on. You see how it brightens this area up right here? It does retain most of the highlights. You can still see these trees in here. But what it doesn't do is it does not increase the global illumination of the TV. So you're not getting any improved illumination of the couch or the foreground here, Ellie, for example, her backpack. It still looks relatively dim to me, and that is why I prefer dynamic tone mapping on. So let's go to dynamic tone mapping off real quick. So you see the only real difference between off and HGiG is just the brightest of bright highlights. So off, HGiG, off, HGiG. Nothing is changing except this sky and maybe some of the specular highlights on the leaves. That's really it. And you're not really, from what I can tell, you're not getting too much clipping. I don't really see any clipping. Maybe a little bit of loss of detail here on the vinage and on this wall right here, but not really. I'd say it looks pretty good. Now, if you go to dynamic tone mapping on, you notice immediately it brightens up the screen on a global level. So the couch and this wall is brightened up just a little bit. So off, on, HGiG to on. And really, it offers, in my opinion, a very pleasing image because you're pumping up that high dynamic range. And like I said, it might not be the most accurate setting because you're globally increasing the luminance of the TV. It's probably not strictly following the EOTF curve. But it, at the same time, is giving you that nice pop in the imagery, which is what I prefer over HGiG, which tends to be too dim. Especially if you are in a dim room with no highlight and no light source like this window, everything looks muted, similar to off. We go back to on, and the camera has a hard time kind of picking up any potential clipping, but rest assured, looking here at the screen sitting 4 feet from it, I notice slightly less detail with dynamic tone mapping on in these little trees right here. So you could say maybe you're losing just the slightest hint of detail. So HGiG on, HGiG on. Yeah, so with dynamic tone mapping on, you're sacrificing the slightest bit of detail in these trees, which probably looks worse on my camera. It probably looks like there's more clipping than there actually is on my camera. But rest assured, sitting in front of the screen, there's a slight loss of detail in these 3 trees back here compared to HGiG, but it's so minimal and so minute that in my opinion, it's not worth going with HGiG, because once you go with HGiG, like I said, you're sacrificing global luminosity of the entire television. You're losing that pop. Let's try going to another area in the game and see if we can't compare another section. Let's take a look at the curtains right here. Not the brightest section, but we'll see if we can see any difference. So, off. This is a minor difference. Again, not globally, just the curtains. So, HGiG. You see what brightens up the curtain a little bit? And it does a decent job of retaining the specular detail in these lines within the curtain. So, off, HGiG. Again, no benefit globally from HGiG. Off, HGiG. And then you go to dynamic tone mapping on, and it really pumps up that brightness. It really does pump up that brightness. And I could see how some people might think that that looks artificial, because it really is pumping up the brightness. And with dynamic tone mapping, what you have is a situation where the TV takes over the tone mapping from the console. With HGiG, like I said, the console's doing the tone mapping. With dynamic tone mapping on, the TV itself is doing the tone mapping, and it's analyzing metadata on a scene-by-scene, frame-by-frame basis. And it's doing its best to try to provide you that punchy, vibrant, aesthetically pleasing image, while at the same time retaining most of the specular highlights. So we'll go off, on, off, on. So when I go to on, I still feel like I can see the detail. I don't know how it's coming through on the camera. I'll have to check in post. But with dynamic tone mapping on, I still feel like I can see most of the detail in the curtain. You go to HGiG, on. But no doubt, with on, you're losing a little detail right here along the side of the curtain. So HGiG, you see how there's a little bit more detail right here in this section of the curtain. On blows it out just a touch. But again, for me personally, I am willing to make that minor and slight sacrifice in order to maintain global illumination. HGiG, on. So let's go see if we can find one more area within this game. Let's see, we have another window. Let's take a look at this area. HGiG, off. HGiG, off. So in my opinion, no difference, none. And that's part of the problem I have with HGiG, is when a game is not specifically developed for it, you're deriving very little benefit, except those brightest of bright highlights. So for example, the sun, you know, that's really it. How often are you going to be looking up at the sun in a video game, you know? Maybe in a game like Doom Eternal, which I do have, but I have yet to install on my PlayStation 4. That game is really colorful with a lot of explosions. Maybe in a game like that, you might derive more benefit from HGiG because there's a lot of bright, specular, colorful highlights. But in a game like The Last of Us, where there's a lot of indirect lighting, where it's primarily overcast a lot of the time, where the colors are muted, there's just not enough benefit from HGiG, in my opinion. Now let's go to on, dynamic tone mapping. Boom, look at that. It just pumps up the color, and it maintains a nice dark image around the window. So you're getting a beautiful contrast between this dark wall inside the building and then the color outside of the building. Off, on. And again, I don't know how well the camera is capturing this. I tried to turn down the light sensitivity with the ISO to try to capture bright details as best I could, but I don't know how it's coming through in the camera. But sitting here in front of the TV, when I go from off to on in this section here where these trees are, I'm not losing any detail. At least with my naked eye, I'm not losing any detail. I can still see everything here perfectly fine. And then same with the details on this building surface. I'm not losing any detail there. I can still see everything. And HGiG looks no different than off. As you can tell, I'm switching between the two right now repeatedly. HGiG, off. HGiG, off. And you notice with HGiG on, the screen in general, it just looks kind of dim. I feel like it's not doing the game justice here in this particular scene, because what you have is on the inside of this building where it's nice and dark, you're not getting, once you look through the window, you're not getting that requisite brightness to generate that contrast you really would like to see between the dark wall and then the outside. Once you go to dynamic tone mapping on, it just really pops. It really brings out the brightness of the leaves, the building surfaces. It feels like it's properly illuminating the exterior of this building while maintaining a good darkness and shadow detail inside of the building where Ellie is standing. Now, with this particular game in mind, the only thing that I find troubling with dynamic tone mapping on is it turns up the brightness quite a bit, and therefore it makes grain, filmic grain, a little bit more apparent in this game. I kind of wish that there was a filmic grain slider within The Last of Us 2's graphics options so that you could turn it up or down as you see fit, but there isn't one, unfortunately. The developers are sort of forcing this implementation of this grain because I'm sure they're going for a cinematic look, and the game does look beautiful. But when you pump up that color with dynamic tone mapping, it really brings out that grain. So that's the only downside I'm really seeing in this game with dynamic tone mapping. Again, HGiG, it just makes everything kind of muted, same as off. I don't see any difference. On, bam. Now let's see real quick if we can find another spot in this game. All right, so here we have a pretty bright spot looking up at the sky. You can see in here the sun is right behind these clouds, and you see some birds flying around. You see the top of this tree. It's all pretty well defined with dynamic tone mapping off. Now let's go to HGiG. It really brightens up this section in the sky. And it does a pretty good job of maintaining details within the top of the tree, and it does a good job of maintaining the birds. You can still see them flying around. Now let's go with dynamic tone mapping on. Interesting. It looks like HGiG is almost brighter. Honestly, this is one of those strange things where HGiG globally is dimmer, but has in some instances a tendency to clip highlights in certain areas. I don't understand why that is. So we go off. The entire screen looks muted. There's not a lot of pop here. It kind of looks like a lot of the rest of the clouds. You go to HGiG and this section really brightens up. Look at that, it really brightens up. And I feel like in this area, you're blowing out highlight detail. Off. See, I can see some billowing on the clouds right in here. It probably isn't coming through in the camera. HGiG, it really blows it out. I don't know. And then you go to dynamic tone mapping on, and it almost seems like, so HGiG looks brighter. HGiG, and then you go dynamic tone mapping on. It makes this area a little bit darker, and I feel like it preserves details a little bit better. HGiG, dynamic, it's hard to say. And again, that's why it's so easy to get into arguments with people in the comment section when it comes to HGiG and dynamic tone mapping. Because it's so, in my opinion, it's so highly subjective. I think on the whole, most people are right when they say that HGiG is probably a slightly more realistic look to the screen and the lighting, and that in general, it tends to preserve highlight detail within specular highlights. It tends to, but as in this instance, you can see it's not foolproof. It doesn't always work that way every time. Sometimes it does blow out highlights, and maybe that's because this is a game that has not been specifically developed for HGiG. When you go to dynamic tone mapping on, let's see, HGiG, dynamic tone mapping on, I feel like it does a better job here of preserving some of the highlights in the clouds, whereas HGiG kind of blows it out a little bit. I don't know how well it's coming through, but it's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Off. Either way, you would be fine to just set HGiG on or off. You do whatever you got to do, and nobody is going to be able to tell you you're right or wrong, really. I think to summarize, based on what I'm seeing in this game, which has a lot of indirect lighting, so it's hard, dynamic tone mapping is like eye candy. It pumps up the brightness across the entire screen, and I could see why some people might say it looks artificial. If you go to HGiG, HGiG does, in general, very little to the image. Globally, it will not improve low and mid-level highlights. The screen will continue to look relatively dim like it does with tone mapping off. However, more often than not, when you look at a very bright highlight like the sun, I find that HGiG does a slightly better job than dynamic tone mapping on in highlight preservation and detail preservation. So this is supposed to be a relatively quick video, but it went on at least, what, 10-15 minutes now. So I'm going to end it here. But I just wanted to bring this video to you to let you know that I myself, whenever I release a picture settings video, I prefer dynamic tone mapping on, but keep in mind other people prefer HGiG or they prefer it to be off entirely. It's a matter of taste and preference. And also keep in mind that most games have not been produced or created with HGiG in mind, so I'm sure we will start to see better implementation once more games have been produced with HGiG in mind. Okay, if you guys found this video helpful or useful in any way, please leave a like and let me know what you think in the comments down below. And until next time, guys, we will see you later. Take care.